we think of cruise ships, which are used for very nice vacations or to see exotic places from a convenient platform.
We have like Carnival lines and cruise ships, which are just basically floating playgrounds. People don't realize that the Lusitania really represented the queens of the seas, and there was a glamour around Titanic, Lusitania, ocean liners.
Lusitania was this magnificent ship that had a great deal of prestige. That's why so many prominent people traveled on it, both British and American, because you could travel on a slower moving, less well-known ship, but that wasn't going to get you on the society page. Whereas traveling on the Lusitania said that you were part of the upper crust. It was a very prestigious act to be part of that. You have to remember that the airplane was less than 10 years old, and it wasn't until many years later that Charles Lindbergh actually flew across the Atlantic Ocean solo. It was the means of getting across the Atlantic Ocean because there was no other way to get there. And if you're going into a war zone, you want to be on a fast ship.
Whenever a ship, a trading ship or a passenger ship or whatever, left New York, they would put ads in the newspaper, New York Times and so on, the day before, saying, you're taking your life in your hands. This ship is sailing into a war zone.
There were people that read the notice that was posted in many American newspapers saying, don't sail in the Lusitania. Some of them said, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't sail into a war zone. Others felt that it was their patriotic duty to do so.
I think Americans were arrogant enough that they said, we want to sail into a war zone and be safe. And so they kept getting on board these ships.
If there's ever a war that should not have been fought, and there's many that's in that category, but if there's ever a prime war that should never been fought, it was World War I. An absolute collapse and failure of leadership and diplomacy.
World War I saw some of the worst losses in modern military history, 18 million dead, 21 million wounded. And I think that's the result of two revolutions that transformed Europe in the 19th century, the industrial and the democratic. The Industrial Revolution gave countries enormous killing power, and the Democratic Revolution made the great mass of the people ready to sacrifice themselves for their country.
The war, when it began, was an act of folly by all sides. No one won that war. There may be people that we talk about as the winners, but no one won. You can argue that Britain and France were shattered by that war, and they were just shadows of themselves, and that were polished off by World War II.
A lot of people going back from the Second World War, where Hitler was clearly in charge of the Germans say, well, both world wars were a clash of good against evil. I think one can make that case for the Second World War, but I don't think so for the First World War. I think the First World War is more a story of the great powers of Europe sliding down into a great war, and they all violated international law. The British violated international law, the Germans violated international law, they all did.
Unlike World War II, World War I was a clash of economies and nations as opposed to a clash of cultures. World War II had Germany, who came into existence in 1871, and so for about 40 years they had been gaining great economic strength, and they felt underappreciated by the world at large, particularly since Kaiser Wilhelm was a first cousin to the King of England, and he felt like they just didn't get enough respect. So in some ways he wanted to establish a greater dominance over Europe. I think he envisioned England as sort of the power of the seas with their great empire, Germany as the center of Europe. So he was sort of aching for a war to show how tough they were. And it's often called the Domino War. There was the murder of the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand. That brought about calls for reprisals against Serbia. Serbia didn't want to give up their sovereignty over an act that they didn't really have control over. The dominoes started falling, and literally within a week, the whole of Europe was at war.
With this one event, what caused this huge war? It was the barn that was littered with straw that was doused in gasoline. They just needed the spark, and that was it. And what was the gasoline and the fuel? The arms race. All over the world, the last vestiges of small tribal countries were game, and the Europeans were in this huge race to gobble up the last part of the world.
I mean, it is like the most foolish thing that could have ever happened. But in context, everyone thought it would be over in 6 weeks. They'd settle new borders and get on with their lives.
Everyone thought the wars were going to be fought really short. They thought, and they had every reason to suppose this. The last two major wars fought in Europe was the Russo-Prussian War, and over 40 years earlier, and just prior to that, a short war between Germany and Austria. These were fast wars in which there was a decisive outcome within a matter of months or weeks. So the idea that the war would be fast was entirely reasonable.
I think if the national leaders had had any idea at the beginning of the war how long it was going to last and what it was going to cost, they would have done anything to keep out of it.
When people think of World War I, they have this vision of trench lines and men going over the top, both German and French, British, later Americans.
Technology is vital in understanding the way World War I was fought, and particularly how it sort of came to a standstill. And that is, in World War I, temporarily, the weapons of defense overshadowed the weapons of offense. And that's what got them trapped in the trench system.
Another innovation is submarines. Now, submarines have been around for a while too, or the concept of having some type of vessel that would go underwater and attack other vessels. It was tried during the American Revolution with the turtle. But the idea of the submarine used by the Germans, the way it was used, the tactic was to starve England, blockade England by sea, not allow any ships or certain vessels from certain nations to get through. So the idea is, well, if this is modern war, if this is total war, then why are we allowing certain vessels through? And so in World War I, we have this aspect where the German Navy, the High Seas Fleet, and so on, has changed policy or to develop policy through Kaiser Wilhelm II to engage with commercial vessels. Now, what were they truly commercial? Were they all commercial? Were they carrying combatants? Were they carrying munitions and war material at times? Yes, they were. Many were.
The Lusitania wasn't as sort of innocent, if you will, innocent passenger ship that people thought it was. It was still in the books as a British auxiliary cruiser, although the British had turned it over to civilian control. There was a lot of ammunition down in the hold. There were at least 300 Canadian soldiers, the Winnipeg Rifles, in civilian clothes. So the Germans knew all that, and they could tell themselves, all right, this is a British cruiser disguised as a civilian passenger ship, and therefore it's fair game. I think the British were desperate enough to get America into the war at any cost or any expense. And I would talk more broadly than just say the Lusitania here. The British tried very hard to set up policies that would force the Germans into undeclared submarine warfare. That is, to sink ships, passenger ships, freighters, and so on, where they hoped Americans would be there as passengers.
I do not personally subscribe to the idea that the British tried to get the Lusitania sank. I think that the British themselves the British Navy itself was trying to figure out how to fight submarines. Personal stories of the people who die on the Lusitania or survive are very compelling. I think that's always very compelling when you have life or death situations where people have to show really what kind of person they are and find out themselves what kind of person they are. They like to talk about one of the richest men in America, Vanderbilt. The last that he was seen was giving up his life jacket to put on a woman and a baby. I find the sense of heroism that emerges in these type of situations inspiring.
There were about 1,700 people on the Lusitania, near 1,200 died. So, a very high loss ratio. Many of those people died in the water because it took a long time to rescue them. The ship actually sunk within sight of land. So people on the Irish coast see that the ship has been hit. Telegraphic messages go out to the Admiralty in Britain immediately and to the press. This small armada of fishing boats start out, some under sail power, some were actually being helped by sailors who were rowing. You had small steam-driven ships, and this little armada is moving out to all of these people who are now floating in the ocean. That had to be one of the bravest acts in history, because who is to say if that German submarine would surface and machine gun the survivors, machine gun the rescuers? I mean, and so to me that was amazing that they would do that. A number of British warships approached, but they immediately turned away, and that was so distressing to the survivors because they thought they were being rescued.
My assumption has always been that they were afraid that they would become the next victim.
And all of this is happening before a world audience. And that's part of the reason that it was such a huge event around the world, is that there were very contemporaneous accounts published in newspapers around the world about this outrageous act on the part of Germany. One of the things that I find interesting is the reaction of the British Admiralty. They had announced to the world that they had taken control of all ships in the war zone, and so the Lusitania should have been proceeding under their protection. All the passengers thought that they were, and the record indicates that most of the crew thought that they were. The truth is the Admiralty didn't send out any ships to protect them, and really did nothing but give some cursory instructions like you ought to consider zigzagging, and here's a course that you ought to follow. Immediately when the ship went down, the Admiralty began to cover its track.
Back at the time, this German diplomat said after the Lusitania was sunk, he said, and I quote, "The American people cannot visualize the spectacle of 100,000 German children starving by slow degrees as a result of the British blockade. But they can visualize the pitiful face of a little child drowning amidst the wreckage caused by a German torpedo," unquote. That sort of says it all, and indicates again the British advantage in all of this.
That this was a real war, that any non-combatant could be a target, a victim at some time. And for the Americans especially, who's straddling this fence, trying to be isolationists, not wanting to get involved in this European war, when 128 Americans go down with this vessel, this prime, beautiful, magnificent British passenger vessel, when it goes under those waves in the North Atlantic, it was a huge shock.
Sort of the outcome of the sinking of the Lusitania is that it gave the British a terrific propaganda advantage over Germany, and they pushed that advantage to the very best of their ability. Winston Churchill, who's a personal hero of mine for what he did in World War II and for his courage between the wars, was fairly duplicitous in his reaction to the Lusitania. He said, "In spite of all its horror, we must regard the sinking of the Lusitania as an event most important and favorable to the Allies. The poor babies who perished in the ocean struck a blow at German power more deadly than could have been achieved by the sacrifice of 100,000 fighting men." So, in terms of the time, this was a momentous event, and the people understood it. As a person who loves history, as a person who's helped co-author some biography and written historical fiction, I really think people ought to be more aware of World War I, because it was part and parcel of the greater conflict that ended with World War II. Stories like the Lusitania put a very human touch on that, and that's why I chose to write about it. I think it's a fascinating story, and one that people would be very interested to learn about and to understand in greater detail.